Alright, so before we get going, this is definitely going to have spoilers in it, so if you have not seen Masters of the Universe Revelation yet, you may want to stop this and go watch it before you watch this. So that being the case, consider yourself warned. Let's get into it. Alright, I want to cover kind of the good and the bad of Masters of the Universe Revelation. So, like I said in my pre-review, most of the time things are not wholly awful and nothing is above reproach. There are things that I liked and there are things that I didn't like. I will also say this, mostly I just don't like things. I am kind of a curmudgeon, and I have a lot of trouble getting pulled into a story in the first place. Everything I view kind of as a producer, not as a audience member. I don't know what it is, personal defect, whatever you want to call it. So let's start with the actual, physical, not so much physical, but let's start with the actual production itself first. Let's start with the bad so we can end on the good, right? That's how these things are supposed to go. So let's start with the voiceover. Now, I'm not talking the acting itself, right? Acting is not really the production. I mean, it is, but it's not. And in general, people's performances were what they were. But really what I'm talking about here is the actual audio mix and how the voices fit the characters. So this goes in with the casting as well. A lot of the voiceover, not all of it, but a lot of the voiceover kind of sounded more like cheap ADR, for lack of a better term. You know how sometimes when you're watching like a live action movie and then a line gets delivered that doesn't quite match up with the scene and maybe the volume's not quite right, it doesn't feel like it's embedded in. Yeah, that's bad ADR. Great example, the whole face looked like an egg line from Boondock Saints when Rock was getting thrown across the room. That was done in ADR, and it does not map well with the scene. It was not mixed appropriately. It doesn't fit well. And there's a lot of examples of that happening, and just because something's animated and it's all voiceover doesn't mean that it is immune to that. The other thing that we have to consider is also that the voices have to fit the characters. And this is really where my bigger gripe comes in. Very specifically, Sarah Michelle Gellar as Tila and Lena Headey as Evelyn. They are not good fits. Sarah Michelle Gellar, her voice does not fit Tila at all. It doesn't fit the updated aesthetic. It doesn't fit the classic aesthetic. Her voice is wrong for Tila. And it's not particularly pleasant to listen to either, but it's just not the right voice. And also Lena Headey, well, okay, I'm biased here. I do not like Lena Headey. I don't generally like her as an actress. But it's more than that. Her voice doesn't really fit the character. Again, because there's precedent set, there's kind of an expectation there, but the way that Evelyn's voice has been handled in the past in both the Filmation cartoon, in the 2000X series, and even in the movie, there was a consistency there, and Lena Headey was just kind of off-brand for that consistency. There was one moment in the first episode where she kind of gritted up her voice as she kind of yelled into a line as she was casting a spell, and it was like, oh, that's it. And then it never happened again, and she just sounded like Lena Headey the rest of the time. She didn't sound like she was acting even. She just sounded like she was delivering lines. It was rather perfunctory and not particularly good. Then, of course, we have a few more kind of not great fits. Like Stephen Root's performance as Cringer was fine. but his voice doesn't fit Cringer. And I was disappointed in that. And then we have Kevin Conroy as Merman. And Kevin Conroy is a seasoned voice actor. He's a good voice actor, but it doesn't fit the character. Certainly, we don't really need the I'm drowning in a cup of water voice that they've done with Merman in the past. But Kevin Conroy was too far off of precedent, and it didn't work. It didn't work at all. I mean, again, what is a fish creature supposed to sound like? But, not that. And then they tried to beef up Orco in this, and there was some good and bad in there. But is it Griffin Newman's voice for Orco started off not very Orco-like. And then you get to episode 3, and he sounds a little bit more like Orco. There are still some things in his delivery. Really, it's in like the pattern and cadence of his voice that just aren't quite right for Orco. Like, he was passable, but definitely not my first choice here. And again, I think one of the problems is that like this thing was cast as if it was a live action movie, and maybe as a big surprise, with the exception of Kevin Conroy, the people that delivered the best vocal performances were actual seasoned voice actors. We can get into that in a minute, but yeah, the people that are just typical normal actors didn't do as well, and it's because they're actually two different skill sets. And finally, on kind of the voiceover thing and characters fitting is Chris Wood's performance as Adam and He-Man was inconsistent. There were times when he was He-Man that he sounded a little bit too much like Adam, and there were times when he was Adam, he sounded a little bit too much like He-Man. He never quite nailed the differentiation between the two characters and temperament. Even if Adam's whole foppish thing is an act, there's still a certain separation there from the heroic, confident, powerful He-Man. And so there was some inconsistency in his vocal performance that was a little bit off-putting. All in all, it wasn't terrible, but like Phil Lamar as Hero was actually more He-Man-like than Chris Wood was as He-Man. All right, just a couple more negative points on the production side, and that is Powerhouse Animation itself. I've said before, I'm not a fan of them. Like the overall, is their quality high? Yeah, I mean they are a higher quality animation studio, but they do some things that I don't like. Right, the art style itself I don't particularly care for. They do weird things with faces that I don't like. Don't like it in Castlevania. Didn't like it in Blood of Zeus. Blood of Zeus was terrible anyway, and I didn't like it here. So they have trouble with faces, and then on top of that, the animation was inconsistent. I mean, and you get this with any animation studio. They put more money and more time in some scenes than others, and so some things look better in certain places and some things look worse in certain places. In particular, Tila's fight with Scareglow, guised as He-Man, was really, really poorly done. But is what we're really talking about there is just some inconsistency problems. And like I said, I don't think any animation studio is above that. I don't think I've ever seen a perfect animation studio. In general, I think the Mike Young Productions animation from the 2000X series was far superior. Yes, it's an older animation, but I actually think that it was better handled, and I do think it was actually more consistent. Also, the use of CGI on top of the animation, especially the machinery and everything. Some studios handle this where like you can still tell that it's CG, but it kind of fits in with the 2D scenery pretty well. But the 3D on top of the 2D in this case They used completely different textures, completely different lighting. It was actually really not well done, and it was pretty off-putting. So that was kind of the bad side of the production. Now, there are some things that were done well. Let's talk about those. So going back to the voice acting, right, and the real good on this, like Diedrich Bader was fantastic as Randor and Trapjaw. I didn't think that he would be that good of a voice actor, but he did really well. And then like the people that are actually professional, voice actors, like Susan Eisenberg as the sorceress, she might have been my favorite voice of the entire thing. She nailed it. Kevin Michael Richardson as, I think I got that name right, as Beastman. Again, fantastic. Again, career voice actor. Henry Rollins actually did a good job as Triclops. I actually think they handled Triclops poorly story-wise, but Henry Rollins' performance was good. But he's done some voice acting before, so maybe he had a good handle on how to do that. Justin Long as Roboto was actually really well handled, like to the point where I couldn't tell it was Justin Long. That's good. And even Jason Mewes' one-liner as Stinkor did not sound like Mewes at all, and that was actually well done. Who would have thought that Mewes would have been a better actor than some of the big names they had, despite the fact that it was just only one line. I'm not going to go through the whole cast, but the bigger point is that people that have made careers on voice acting do it better. And there were some surprises also in just regular on-screen actors who did a good job voice acting. So there was some real good in there on top of the things that I've been complaining about. And on the visual side of things, the way that they utilize kind of the camera movement, especially for action sequences, was really good. It was nicely dynamic camera movement. They actually particularly did that with Man-at-Arms, and there are some troubles with Man-at-Arms later. Another voice actor that I didn't think fit. Liam Cunningham is a fine actor and all that. His voice just doesn't fit Man-at-Arms. His performance was fine. I just don't think he was the right voice for the job. But yeah, especially when they were doing Man-at-Arms action sequences, their use of camera movement and dynamics was really good. And the fact that we can do kind of camera movement with animation now is really cool. And so the fact that they handled that so well, I was really impressed and pleased with. So, there's some good on the production side of things. All right, now let's get into the story notes. And really, this is the meat of the matter. This is the stuff that people have been complaining about. This is stuff that people have been complaining about. The story is just the meat of the thing, right? That's where everything happens. And the fact is that if a story is excellent, you can forgive a lesser production. And if a story is excellent, you can even forgive some design flaws and whatnot, some visual flaws and things. So, again, let's start with the bad and work our way towards the good. All right, so first things first is the plot was actually kind of standard fare, formulaic, kind of perfunctory. For all this talk of there's twists and turns and, and subversion of expectations, well, the fact is that it didn't, and it couldn't. The reason that it couldn't is because, again, this is a toy property, and they released toys ahead of time, and the toys kind of give away a lot of the major plot points. And then Kevin Smith himself leaked some plot points. And the fact is that even if we didn't have the leaks in the toys, just the hints that people were giving, specifically Smith himself was giving, on the idea of things being taken to the next level, being grittier, having stakes. I don't think he knows what stakes are. Having death on the line is not actually upping the stakes. That's a misunderstanding of what story actually is. Most of us in everyday life, we have stakes in our own lives, and most of us aren't teetering on the edge of death with those stakes. Tension and release in storytelling does not require death to be high stakes. And even the mid-season cliffhanger ending, right? They always do this. All right, they always do this. Every TV series, I mean, especially now, post writers strike and all that, now that they do this mid-season break, it's more than just the holidays, but like a 6 to 8 week break between halves of seasons, they always end on some big dark note. It was to be expected. And again, the cliffhanger ending was completely spoiled by the toys. So like there was nothing to write home about there. And the fact is that it was almost to be expected, just the way that Smith was talking about writing the story. So not particularly clever plot arc. One of the things that really kind of bothered me about it was the fact that even if they were going to make it more mature, more metal, as Smith put it, they completely sapped all of the whimsy and joy from the original series out. Stuff that they managed to maintain in the comic books, which actually dealt in life and death. Something that they managed to maintain in the 2000X series, which felt like a teenage version as opposed to a children's version. There's still whimsy and joy. I mean, it's still a fantastical, nonsensical, don't look too hard, under the hood kind of story. And it felt like they just kind of bled all of that whimsy out, and rather than it actually enhancing the story or making it feel more mature, it just made it feel lifeless. And then they go into this kind of device that gets used a lot. So oftentimes, and this is especially true in science fiction and fantasy, where things don't necessarily operate in the common knowledge sphere of things. And so things need to be explained so that the audience can catch up. And there's a few ways to do that. There's traditional exposition, which is generally frowned upon. There is introducing it to an innocent or naive character. And then there is just kind of the discovery process throughout the story. And they end up just going with kind of exposition heavy monologues throughout a lot of it. And it's not particularly well handled. Now, there is one good one that actually works, and I'll come to that in a minute, but in general, these exposition heavy monologues, they don't fit organically into the story, and they're often handled in a way that's just like, why are you telling this character this thing? This would be known to this character. So not well handled. They're trying to do it like speaking to a naive, but they end up not doing that well, and it doesn't work out. And also, like, the way that they introduce some of the character names is just like ridiculous. People don't introduce themselves that way. People don't get introduced that way. People, like, it's just it was such a bolt-on feature that it really could have been handled better and more organically, and they just opted to do the bolt-on, and it's a little too obvious and not great. They also use a few flashbacks to keep He-Man in the story. We'll come back to that in a minute. But the flashbacks don't actually feel necessary to the story. It feels like what they're doing is using the flashback as a way to say, hey, remember this thing that happened? Except that it just happened 5 minutes ago because you showed it to us, not because it happened like in the original series or anything like that. the flashbacks actually felt more like they were a pacifier to say, see, He-Man's really in this, as opposed to something that actually makes sense to drive the plot or anything like that. Not a good use of flashbacks there. I mean, they felt like padding. They didn't feel necessary. Oh, and while we're talking about kind of poorly done scenes, let's talk about the scene where Evelyn reveals herself and her interaction with the sorceress, when they get reintroduced. The scene was not properly done. It was not properly done at all. It's one thing to say, hey, Tila and Andra are walking into a scenario where they don't know the full information and it looks like something that it's not. But that's not how they handled the scene. They handled the scene like, well, these guys are already here. And it was almost like Evelyn was putting on performance art for them just so they could set up Cringer jumping in and delivering his monologue. It was a terrible scene. It was clunky. They could have handled that so much better. There's a number of ways they could have done it, and the way they opted to was just the clunkiest way that I can possibly imagine. One thing that I should mention, this goes back to episode 1, and this is just kind of like, this is a really history quibble, but so the title of Man-at-Arms, right? Man-at-Arms, Duncan, is named Duncan, and Man-at-Arms is his title. Man-at-Arms is actually a historical title as well. And Man-at-Arms is basically a weapons master, typically would have been engaged as a mounted cavalry unit, whatever. Men-at-arms could be knights, but they were also mercenaries and even just soldiers who were outstanding soldiers. Being a man-at-arms is not the same thing as being a knight, and you don't get knighted man-at-arms. That's not how that works. So Tila being knighted man-at-arms doesn't make sense. Technically speaking, in her role as captain of the guard, she's already a man-at-arms. So, other than the fact that she could be getting recognized as a weapons master, it was nonsense. Now, granted, Eternia is not Earth. Maybe things work differently on Eternia. Obviously, things work differently on Eternia. But then use a different term or something like that. That's just something for the history nerds. Now, one of the things, and this isn't, I don't know that this is necessarily a bad thing, but it is a notable thing to observe, and that is that these 5 episodes really played more like a 2-hour movie than like a TV series. So even with a TV series that, has a continuous storyline and doesn't just reset every episode, generally speaking, the episodes are not going to run into each other that way. And some of the reason for that is when you try to do that with episodes, you end up with kind of a lot of lulls, a lot of dead spots. Because of this, a lot of episode 2 and even a lot of at least the early parts of episode 3 are kind of forgettable because they feel like, well, their setup and their movement, but they're not plot really. It just creates a lull. And, it's funny, I remember Kevin Smith actually griping about Lord of the Rings being 3 movies about walking. And that's essentially what he has created here, is a movie of characters just kind of walking. Maybe no more so than Lord of the Rings, but certainly no less so than Lord of the Rings. There's a lot of meandering in there. That perhaps if you look at it as a 5-episode part 1 movie, kind of makes sense, but if you look at it as a 5-episode TV series, it doesn't make sense. They are different formats. So like I said, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but then just release it as a movie. Don't release it as 5 episodes, because the formatting change actually kind of changes the flow of it as well. All right, and then the last negative point I want to talk about on the story side of things is actually all of the retconning they did. They did so much retconning. Like, originally Roboto was from an alien planet, and this time he's a creation of Man-at-Arms. So that's a complete twist. Obviously, they did the race switching, which again is not at all the most egregious form of it, but it is, again, lazy storytelling. The characters turned out fine. They were fine characters, but they should have been original characters because they were fine. And then, like, Orco's origin story, they retconned the hell out of, giving them this whole thing of, oh, I mispronounced my real name, and my real name is this English word. Come on, right? And then they were talking about how his parents didn't even like him because he was bad at magic. And it's like, well, originally he was actually quite a good magician on Trala, and his uncle, Montork, was an amazing magician on Trala. And when he lost his wand when he came to Eternia, that's when things went bad, right? Because he no longer had his powerful conduit, and he was less connected to the magic of Trala. So they completely retconned Orco to try to make him a more sympathetic character. And look, Orco's last stand was actually pretty well handled. They made him actually more heroic than, they made him as heroic as he wanted to be originally, but more heroic than he was ever capable of being originally. And again, it's not like it was super poorly done, but it's a weird retcon. And then the retcon that really bothers me, possibly the biggest one that bothers me, is that Preternia is no longer prehistoric Eternia, and Subternia is no longer subterranean Eternia. They're now, basically Hades and the Elysian Fields. And I get that for the point of the story they were telling, but that's a complete retcon of it. And then it also makes Preternia and Subternia even less sensical names than they were before. So they could have easily just created unique terms, or just use heaven and hell like they actually did in the story. Because they're obviously mixing in regular Earth, English terminology anyway. So that was a weird choice, not one that I liked. Hey, look, Scareglow as a Hades figure was actually pretty cool. It was a really cool use of the character, but that's not Subternia. That's Hades. So, I don't know why they made that decision, but I don't like it. And I also don't like the fact that they made Grayskull, Castle Grayskull, an illusion cloaking the Hall of Wisdom. They've handled the Hall of Wisdom and the elders and everything differently before, which I preferred before. Again, I keep going back to the 2000X series because I really love the 2000X series. The 2000X series and the 2012 to 2015 run up through the Eternity War are my favorite iterations of He-Man by far. So I do have a bias there. But they kind of handled the Great Hall and the Elders and Castle Grayskull and all of that before. And so this choice was, I think, a little bit weird. And granted, they weren't really referencing the comics or 2000X, not really. They did do some hat tips there, but I don't know. I didn't care for that. It's not a deal breaker, but I didn't care for that. All right, the last complaint that I have about the story, the last real complaint that I have about the story, is the whole Triclops and Trapjaw go become cult leaders. that's way off brand for them. Those two were mercenaries. Now like, hey, look, Triclops was this massive, awesome, engineer, and his relationship with tech, they explored in the comics a lot, was really, really, really cool. So him being like this, tech master, even to the point of being like a techno mage, it was kind of a cool idea. And, Trapjaw being included in that is fine. But the thing is, they're both kind of mercenaries. They're guns for hire. It would have been better if they had kind of done like more of a mafia vibe rather than a cult vibe. The cult vibe, and then the language that they were using was even more on the nose than Masters of the Universe typically gets. And it wasn't the whimsical and fun side, it was just the nonsense side. So it didn't work. And again, Henry Rollins' performance for what he was given was fine, but the whole cult vibe was, it was just not good. I much would have preferred kind of like a mafia, or even some other thing, smugglers or something like that. I mean, Triclops and Trapjaw are really never shown as being too megalomaniacal. They sometimes think they can lead better than Skeletor, but they're never really shown as like wanting to take over the world. So the idea of going into a position like a cult leader doesn't really make sense for those characters. And so pushing them into something more where they can just have like power grabs and cash grabs and stuff, and even with Triclops' mastery of technology, having him do some kind of like, hey, now that magic is gone, technology can reign, and become even like a corporate overlord or something, that could have been cool. In fact, I would love to see corporate Triclops. That could actually be kind of fun. Maybe it wouldn't be appropriate either. But I don't think the way they handled it was right. So now on the good side of the story, though, right? Because there's good with this, right? It's like they didn't just produce a pile of crap, and I want to put this out there. I didn't hate it. I was disappointed, but I didn't hate it. And the disappointment is a lot on me because I set the bar high. I stayed hopeful in spite of all the negative press. I stayed hopeful in spite of the Hollywood industry. Because this is something that I love and care about. And so I really tried hard to find good. I did. And I did find some. So first up, I thought it was actually really cool that they gave some, wordplay hat tips, to other pieces of the property, especially in the first episode. I like the fact that they introduced kind of underused and unused characters from the toy line. There was some really cool stuff that they did that really kind of enhanced the ability of them to tell that story. Down to using Stinkor as just kind of like a weird, evil mercenary and everything. Like there was some really cool stuff to play with there. And I think they did a pretty good job with that. And perhaps my favorite use of all of that was using Scareglow as a Hades figure. I think he was a good fit for that role. And because he's never really been depicted in the cartoons and had very few comic book appearances, there was a lot of room for them to actually play with that character and like, what does he do and who is he? And so... there was some really cool stuff there, and even on the heroes side of it, like showing all the former, champions of Grayskull, the other He-Men, even with the race swap King Grayskull, they never actually made him. They never made any allusions to him being a blood ancestor of Adam the way he was in the 2000X series. So you might as well look at this as an alternate universe kind of thing. Different kind of champion, that's fine. And, getting to see some of the other He-Men on film, right? On screen was cool. So being able to use those really kind of allowed them to do more with the story. They could have told a perfectly fine story without the addition of those, but it definitely makes it richer. All told, hey, episode 1 was kind of right on. I mean, it wasn't perfect, but episode 1, they at least tried to make it have a similar or the same feel as the old series. You had that fun and whimsy for about 5 minutes, but the bright colors and smiles and jokes and all that, they did generally well. And ramping up episode 1 to move into the main story, they did generally pretty well. Now, there was a hard left turn going into episode 2, and the rest of it diverged quite a bit. But that first episode actually kind of worked. I also think that first episode had the worst vocal mix as well. So that's one of those things where, story and all that made up for the fact that the actual nuts and bolts production wasn't necessarily all that great. And you remember how I said Evelyn gave an actual decent expositional monologue? They do this at the end of episode 2 when she's explaining how magic works on Eternia and all of that. And because not everybody is a sorcerer, a magician, whatever, that would be somewhat occult knowledge and something that perhaps somebody like Tila and Andra wouldn't necessarily know. And so her explaining that and doing so very briefly and succinctly actually worked. And that's where you can do that and it works. But most of the other places where they did it, it didn't work. And the overall plot, really the idea of, and this really isn't even a spoiler, even though we're already well past that point. But the overall plot of magic is no longer flowing through Eternia is actually a good plot line that they could have done. That they, of all the plot lines they could have chosen, that's a really good one, and that's actually one that can up the stakes. They didn't need to do with the story what they did. They didn't need to kill off He-Man in order to do that. There's a number of ways they could have done it. In fact, if they had made it where the sword split and Adam loses the He-Man powers, and you could still have Skeletor disappear the way he did. But, having Adam just lose his powers and have to interact and adventure along with the team, and with Tila being mad at him, and even having maybe 2 teams going off and doing things, they could have done it in an ensemble way that wouldn't have been so much at the expense of previously strong characters like Man-at-Arms. They could have done that so much better than they did. And they clearly did this because they wanted to push Tila to the forefront and tell her story. And I get that. She's got a great story, provided they're going where I think they're going with it. But I think they did it at the expense of Adam and Duncan and, kind of the core of what Masters of the Universe was. And so I have my gripes there, but in general, that plot line that they did of magic being erased from Eternia because of a bad choice on Skeletor's part, it's a great plot line. We can move forward with that. I just think they move forward in kind of a way that didn't work so well. And I will mention one more time, at one point Evelyn mentioned that Man-at-Arms was the real threat. And yet in the first episode, they kept on showing him having to be rescued by He-Man or somebody else. They kept on showing him getting beaten down and having to have somebody else step in front of him. Rescued by Orco, rescued by He-Man. You can't really have it both ways. They were so inconsistent. Like, is Man-at-Arms this badass that you show him? They animated him better than anybody else in the fight scenes. And then they also show him as being weak and constantly needing the help of others. And it's just like, you can't have it both ways. And like, you could show him having flaws, you could show him having foibles and all that, but I think the way they did it was, again, just kind of turning the knob down on him rather than actually developing the character. All right, and the last thing we have to talk about in story is the Tila and Andra relationship. And no, I don't feel like they were doing any queer baiting with it. I don't feel like they were alluding to Andra being Tila's girlfriend or anything like that. There were a couple of glances that they animated that I could see where people would interpret it that way. But when you look at the delivery of the lines and the context of the scene and all of that, Tila and Andra almost came off more as like a buddy cop duo. They came off like best friends. They came off like, good friends, work associates, right? I mean, definitely friendlier than just work associates, but they seemed like friends adventuring. They did not actually seem like a couple. And they were pretty firm throughout the whole thing that Tila was really in love with Adam, He-Man. She really valued her relationship with Adam. She really valued her relationship with He-Man. And then Adam and He-Man were always depicted as really, leaning on her as well. They kept that solid. I really don't feel like they pushed Tila and Andra as a couple or anything like that. So that is one thing that I'm very, very pleased with, that they didn't do kind of a characterization swap on. A lot of people still, because I've seen some of the reviews since watching it, but a lot of people are still feeling like they pushed the relationship between the two, and I don't feel that they did. I feel that there were, I think, just two glances that looked a little bit beyond that, but I don't think that in context that you would necessarily read that in. If you've ever watched female best friends, they are much more affectionate towards each other than men are. So it doesn't come off that way. So I'm happy with that. And in fact, I think that Andra was well voiced, well acted. I think she was for what little they gave her. Because after episode 2, they kind of backburnered her in favor of Tila and Evelyn playing off of each other. Good cop, bad cop kind of thing. But for what they gave Andra, I actually liked the character a lot. They did a lot of good with that character. It basically was a brand new character because Andra was never depicted in anything really. Single comic book panel. But, so blank slate character, but that easily could have been a brand new character and it would have been fine. She was well written, well done. Totally fine with that character. All right, let's finish off with just a couple of notes on some of just the more just purely aesthetic design elements, things that aren't really here or there, just things that were noticeable, especially noticeably different than the source material, and goods and bads. So, like with the good things, I've mentioned before, I really liked that kind of HM logo, that spiky H logo. It's a callback to the old toys and kind of the direction they were going with those toys anyway. I was totally fine with that. So using that instead of the cross patee on He-Man's chest, totally fine with. I really loved that they used the more properly formed sword from the mini comics as opposed to the more toy looking sword. The Filmation sword looked a little bit more like the toy sword, which of course kind of made some sense because of limitations of toy production and all. But the fact is that the properly shaped and formed sword like they had in the mini comics, so much better. So I really liked that choice there. I didn't really have a problem with the transformation sequence. A lot of people were saying it looked like Sailor Moon. Fine. The opalescence thing doesn't really bother me. I totally get that reference, but that's not bothersome to me. And kind of having kind of an embodied energy silhouette with then the armor manifesting on top. It was fine. It didn't bother me at all. I thought they did well with that. Would it have been my first choice if I was designing it? Probably not, but it wasn't bad. It's really not bothersome. I will say I thought it was kind of weird that they didn't give He-Man the scabbard, the sheath for his sword like he wore in the original Filmation series. I know the toys have never really put it in a sheath, but the Filmation series did, and this one he just had a weird kind of slit in his harness. And I don't know, not my favorite of choices, but I mean I guess that would make it easier to draw the sword than having it in a proper sheath, because drawing a sword from your back is hard to do. They also probably should not have made the sword a two-handed sword, really kind of a hand and half, because your proper two-handed sword there's going to be some space. But even so, it's always been a one-handed sword, so let's just keep it a one-handed sword. One weird choice. Well, a lot of the costume updates and stuff were totally fine. Didn't find them bothersome at all. I did find it weird though. Everybody's complaining about Tila's haircut, which there's a lot to complain about there because it's an awful haircut. Evelyn has always been shown with short white hair, and they gave her like long flowing white hair in this one. So they kind of swapped the two characters on haircuts, and I also think that half-shaved punk Karen haircut would have been better fitting of Evelyn than of Tila. But whatever. So I'm sure there's more to say. I'm sure there's more that I'll think of. I'm sure that I will walk away from filming this and think of more. But I think that's fine. I've gone on quite a while. This is definitely a longer video. They didn't knock it out of the park, but it was also not the dumpster fire that some would have had you believe. And the fact is that I think it was as bad as it was good. This is something that I would give kind of a C or a C- to. It's not an absolute fail, but it was a disappointment. It was, it's third place at best, right? And I have to say that, one of the things that I wrote down, because I've watched it twice through already. I stayed up late to watch it last night, and I watched it again just a little bit ago. And one of the comments that I made on Facebook last night, and I'm still kind of holding to, though it was better the second time through than it was the first, some of the shock of it being different wore off a little bit. Some of the voice acting performances, though, kind of felt like they were trying to act rather than actually acting in some cases. Sometimes it was flat. An all-star cast doesn't always mean an all-star performance. And so they definitely could have done better there. I'm definitely looking forward to part 2. I hope they release that soon. There was no reason for them to split it up into 2 parts. That's asinine. But, I mean, on the one side, I'm glad He-Man's back, but on the other side, I think damage has been done, and this may actually harm prospects for more He-Man in the future. Hollywood and fans do not always mix well. So, I don't know what else to say about it. One thing is for sure, Masters of the Universe in every iteration has changed to basically be an almost completely different universe, to the point where they actually did a He-Man multiverse comic run recently, a little mini-series, which was actually good, by the way. He-Man is constantly changing, and some for the good and some for the bad. And, this doesn't ruin anything that came before. It doesn't cancel out anything that came before. But also, we've been waiting so long, and for it to be just kind of mediocre it's a disappointment. So I'm going to leave it there, and I will talk to you guys later. Good journey.